Okay, and we're live. This is Deacon Joseph Swaden.
Bishop Enoch.
Benedicite. And today for the Orthodox Apologetics channel, we are here. It's the Feast of Pentecost. Happy feast to all our listeners, and we're going to be talking about something that we've talked about a bit. Okay. Well, hello. Okay. I'll just say hello to all. Anyway. And one thing that we've been talking about is we've been talking about the fall of the Orthodox West. We've talked about Hildebrand, and I don't think that what happens is we haven't talked about really. It's still, I think, hard for people to wrap their heads around because of the fact that they don't realize how stark the changes of the 11th century were. And so today we're going to talk about one of the most obvious differences between Orthodoxy and the Roman Catholic Church that actually was not a difference at the time of the schism. And so we're going to be talking about married priests in the Orthodox West. Now, we've covered this with the letter of Ulrich of Imola of Lidica. We've covered this on the War Zone. We've covered this on our show and in a few different places where he protested the policy of forcing married priests to relinquish their marriages. And I think in a recent show you mentioned that in France, the wives of priests were enslaved. So basically what we're going to be touching on is a text, part of a text today. You can see it in the About box, referred to as the York Anonymous. And so we want to make clear that this was not just an isolated bishop in Italy. This was not just a small group of people in France. That, again, this was the entire Orthodox West, that there were married priests, just like in the Orthodox Church, right up to the time of the schism and the Hildebrandian Reform. And so, Lidica,
yes.
If you want to add some
just a little bit. The York Anonymous, sometimes called the Norman Anonymous, because we don't really. It was at one point believed it was written by a Norman priest living in York. We don't really know, but we know it was written as part. It's actually a large manuscript, about 400-500 pages, and it contains a host of what are essentially anti-Hildebrandian tractates. And very few of them have actually been translated into English. The only reason this one has a full English translation is about 3 pages or so, I think, right? Yeah, 4 pages. It's because Joseph Hall, who was a Anglican in the 1600s, who was in disputes with Roman Catholics, had discovered it, and he basically translated it. It's a good translation, and published it to kind of refute them. Now, it also, turns out it helps the Orthodox case as well. But there are still other treatises. I've been working actually on translating another of the York Anonymous treatises, which deals with the rights, which deals with the investiture specifically and the rights of kings, and it's actually rather interesting. And that might be something we could later deal with in a future episode. But it's a rather interesting compilation of a compilation book, and they have like a whole treatise on the powers, what's acceptable for the Pope to do, what's not acceptable. There's, they didn't hold an ultramontane view, obviously. So this is it's no wonder it hasn't been a much discussed or translated text.
Well, that's why I'm fascinated.
Except among some very specific scholars who, there is a book called the Norman Anonymous that's like a review of the text, but they provide very few translations of it. And oftentimes when I've read parts of that book on Google Books. It's like a review, and it's now there was something called the Electronic Norman Anonymous Project, in which they were making translations online, or at least, and it just kind of disappeared.
Yeah, and it didn't go anywhere. They got their funding and it stopped.
Yeah. And now one more point about the translation I'm doing now, not this one, but this is. I was actually doing my own translation of this before I discovered Joseph Hall's translation, and then I was like, well, he did it already. But the other one I'm doing on the rights of kings in the Christian Commonwealth from the York Anonymous is interesting because there are sections of it where it's obvious that secular scholars don't really know what it's talking about, and they're. For example, just not to go too far, from one point in the other translation I'm doing on the rights of Christian kings, they say the author of the translation, they say the priest who wrote it believed the king could celebrate mass or something. But if you actually look at the Latin text, it just says he was allowed to bring and offer his gifts at the altar. which in fact Byzantine emperor could do that. That's just at the offertory he could bring bread and wine and hand it to a deacon or something like it. And I'm just saying that's an example of the problem with secular scholars who have no real heavy liturgical background in the Orthodox West begin to look at these things. They don't know what they're talking about. But we're dealing with
the worst part of this is that you would think a text of such consequential importance, I mean, as you mentioned, it's over 400 pages long, has been largely untranslated, and yet everyone has an assumption that the investiture controversy, as it is discussed by Roman Catholic and other historians, is complete. How can something be complete if a major text of that time is just left untranslated? It should indicate at least the doctrinal biases of the earliest people who worked on the history of the fall of the Orthodox West. And so I think that that's something that it definitely does need to be translated, and it's a shame that it hasn't. But I'm glad that you're working on it, Vladika, and hopefully more people will try to translate other parts of it. To all coming in, happy Feast of Pentecost, and we're discussing married priests in the Orthodox West, because this is one of those things that the estrangement hypothesis is drilled in our minds, that the West was pretty much celibate since at least the 6th to 7th century, and then it just blew up in in everyone's faces in the 11th. This is not the truth. So in any case, we can get started. I mean, we have the text, as I mentioned here, so we're gonna read through it. I'm gonna do some reading of it, and then Vladika, if he has comments, we're gonna go like that. It's a short text. It's only about 3 to 4 pages, and then after that, of course, we're back to issuing our open challenges. At this point, I don't know if anyone. I don't hear from anyone except occasionally from people on Twitter that are most holy family converts that can't really talk much, but we're issuing an open challenge to anyone who wants to interact with us and discuss their objections to the Orthodox faith, and that's an open challenge. So if you can think of anyone, if anyone of our listeners says, "Oh, well, maybe they could talk to this guy," throw it out there. We'll look at it, but we'll get started now. So give me just a moment to get the text, okay? Hello?
Yes, I'm waiting.
Okay, great. Give me a moment, just loading this up here, and I guess I can put it on the screen, because that's always handy, so let's do that. Hold on. Okay, share screen, and application window. Tab. And we're still waiting for it to load. So once it does, I can start reading it, which is going to be loads of fun. Okay. Still not seeing it. Hold on a moment, guys. As you can see, we're just waiting for the little colorful ball to stop spinning and for the text to show up.
I can start reading it if I need to. I mean, I have it before me here.
Give me a moment. Let me. I can open it up from the PDF, but let me see if I can then put the PDF on screen. Give me just a moment.
But in the meantime, just so people understand, this text is taken from Joseph Hull's 17th century translation of the York anonymous treatise from the 1080s, which was written to defend in that time in England to defend married priests. Yeah. So, and it's part of the larger York, or not sometimes called the Norman Anonymous, which is a text of some 350 to 400. Is a large text. So you can find the text if you're interested in the Latin, either on the digitized manuscript. There's an online digitized manuscript, and if not that, then the Monumenta Germana.
No, I got it. Okay. So now we're just gonna put this in more full size. Okay, so from the York Anonymous, it says, whether it is licit for priests to enter matrimony, I would fain know who it was that first ordained that Christian priests might not marry God or man. For if it were God, surely his determination is to be held and observed with all veneration and reverence. But if it were man and not God, and this tradition came out of the heart of man, not out of the mouth of God, then neither is salvation got by it if it be observed, nor lost if it be not observed. For it does not belong to a man either to save or destroy any man for its merits, but it is proper only unto God. Therefore God has ordained this, that God has ordained this is neither found written in the Old Testament, nor in the Gospel, nor in the epistles of the apostles, in all which is set down whatsoever God hath enjoined unto men. It is therefore a tradition of man, and not an institution of God, nor of his apostles, as the apostle instituted rather that a bishop should be the husband of one wife, which he would never have been appointed if it had been adultery for a bishop to have at once a wife in a church, as it were two wives, as some like to affirm. Now that it which hath not authority from the Holy Scriptures is with the same facility condemned that is spoken, and he says, see St. Jerome, commentary on Matthew chapter 23, for the Holy Church is not the wife nor the spouse of the priest, but of Christ. As St. John saith, he that hath the bride, he is the bridegroom. Of this bridegroom I say that the church is the spouse, and yet it is lawful even for this spouse in part to marry by the apostolic tradition. For the apostle speaks thus to the Corinthians, because of fornications let every man have his own wife. And I would that all men were as I am, but every man hath the proper gift of God, one thus and another otherwise. For all men have not one gift, namely of virginity and continency, but some are virgins and contain, and others contain not, to whom he granteth marriage, lest Satan tempt them through their incontinency, and should they miscarry in the ruin of their uncleanness. So also of priests some are continent, and others are incontinent. And those which are continent have received the gift of their continence from God, without whose gift and grace they cannot be continent. But those which are incontinent have not received this gift of grace, but whether by the intemperance of their humor or the weakness of their mind, run out of fleshly desires, which they would in no wise do if they had received from God the grace and virtue of continence. For they also, which are delivered by the grace of God from the body of this death, feel another law in their members, rebelling against the law of their mind, and captivating them to the law of sin, and compelling them to do that which would not. This law, therefore, is holding them captive, and the concupiscence of the flesh provoking them. They are compelled either to fornicate or marry. Wherefore, whether is better? We are taught by the authority of the apostle, who tells us it is better to marry than to burn. Surely that which is the better is to be chosen and held. Now it is better to marry because it is worse to burn, and it is better because it is better to marry than to burn. It is convenient for those which contain not to marry, not to burn. For marriage is good, as Augustine speaks in his book Super Genesima Litra. It is commended the good of nature, whereby the pravity of incontinence is ruled, and the fruitfulness of nature graced. For the weakness of either sex declining towards the ruin of filthiness is well relieved by the honesty of marriage. So as the same thing which may be of the office of the sound is also the remedy unto the sick. Neither yet, because incontinence is evil, is therefore marriage, even that wherewith the incontinent are joined, to be reputed not good. Yea, rather, not for the evil is the good faulty, but for this good is that evil pardonable, since that good with marriage hath, yea, which marriage is, can never be sin. Now this good is threefold: the fidelity, the fruit, the sacrament of the estate. In the fidelity is regarded that, besides this bond of marriage, there be not carnal society with any other. In the fruit of it, that it be lovingly raised and religiously bred. In the sacrament, that marriage be not separated, and that the dismissed party of either sex be not joined to any other, no, not for issue's sake. This, as it were, is the rule of marriage, whereby the fruitfulness of nature is graced, or the pravity of incontinence ruled. And this rule of marriage, and this threefold good, the eternal truth hath appointed, in the order of his decree, and that eternal law of his, against which whatsoever is done, spoken, or willed is sin. Which Augustine in his book against Faustus the Manichae witnesses, saying sin is either deed, word, or desire against the law eternal. The eternal law is the divine will or the decree forbidding the disturbance and commanding the preservation of due natural order. Whatsoever therefore commands natural order to be disturbed, forbids it to be conserved, prohibits men to use marriage and to attain to the good rule thereof, fidelity, issue, sacrament, and commands them to break the rule of eternal truth, whereby the fruitfulness of nature is grace, or the pravity of incontinency ruled, commands men to abhor those things, whereby natural order is held and maintained. This commandment, I say, forbids natural order to be observed, commands it to be disturbed, and therefore is against the law of God, and by consequence is sin. For they sin that ordain such a command by which the natural order is destroyed. These men do not, it seems, believe that the children of priests God takes for the building of a city above, and for restoring of the number of angels. For if they did believe it, they would never ordain such a mandate, because they should wittingly and over-rashly go to effect that the supernal city should never be perfected, and the number of angels never repaired. For if the supernal city to be perfected, even the sons of priests, and if the number of angels be of them to be repaired, those that they endeavor to procure that should not be, do what in them lies, destroy the supernal city, and labor that the number of angels may not be perfected, than which what more can be perversely done? For this is against the will and predestination of him which hath done those things which shall be, for he has done in his predestination those things which shall be in effect. Shall I continue, or?
Well, do you have any points to make?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things that it strikes me that's really interesting about this text is it talks about the natural order of marriage, and this is something that Ulrich of Imola brings up, but this is also something that we brought up in the other text that was written by what, I forget his name. He was writing to the emperor. It was the long text where basically when Hildebrand was defeated. But you remember?
Oh, you mean Peter Crassus's text?
Yes, Peter Crassus's text. There's a constant theme in this where they're all talking about how marriage is the natural order. It does not mention it so far in this text, and I don't think that it does. But in both Peter Crassus and Ulrich of Imola, you find exactly that in the cases that those people who were trying to force celibacy on the priestly community, they themselves had a great deal of perversions. And so they were in Ulrich's case. He specifically says that they're basically saying, well, you can do such things in secret, which is basically fornication. And that Peter Crassus also points this out in Hildebrand's Travels. So these people, not only were they, not interested in some sort of purity, but simply a perceived purity, whereas they were even more perverse, and as this document points out, against the natural order than that which was already established in the West, which was the married priesthood.
Well, a lot of times when they use the term that they engage in vices far worse than fornication, they're talking about a lot of these people were engaged in sodomy.
Yeah.
And that it was a lot of the times this was the attempt to force this issue on everybody was almost like a cover for those types of people.
Yeah, and that's exactly, Ulrich makes that point as well. And this leads to our first question, which popped up from Kevin. It says, was priests being married started by one sect, or were there many groups against married priests? I think in the 11th century, I think we pretty much answered that probably the major group that was involved was the Patarines in that particular case. I don't know if there were other sects that were also against them. Are you aware of any?
Say that again?
Well, the question was priests being unmarried started by one sect, or were there many groups against married priests?
Well, I think we have to be a little bit careful here. You can find various decretal letters by some. I mean, they're generally in the form of rescripts by some popes and things like that. That they emphasize that because deacons and priests and bishops should, in their view, be always at mass, they should be perpetually continent. But they never made them separate from their wives at the time.
Right, but that's I think that's what Kevin's talking about.
It was largely a failure to begin with. And this is why, for example, when people would bring up to the defenders of married clergy, Pope Siricius's letter to the Bishop of Tarragona or something like that. The letter, would talk about how can the deacon or how can the priest serve at the divine oblation every day or the divine sacrifice and go sleep with his, wife. And they would quote the Levitical law almost. All right. And the fact is that no, canonically you can't do that if you're going to be celebrating Mass every single day. All right. For example, you do find Canon 13 of Trullo did say, since we know, I read it, it says, since we know it is handed down as a role of the Roman Church that those who are deemed worthy to be advanced to the diaconate or presbyteriate should promise no longer to cohabitate with their wives, we, preserving the ancient role in apostolic perfection order, will that lawful marriage of men who are holy and holy orders be from this time forth firm by now. But anyway, the Council of Trullo actually dealt with this issue. And I mean, this is actually a longer discussion we could get into because there are a lot of Roman Catholics who try to maintain that before the Council of Trullo, there weren't no married priests at all anywhere. I don't know if you've heard that argument, but
I feel like we've diverged somewhat. Okay, so we have.
My point was that. Okay, go ahead.
we have to decode two streams in what Vladika Enoch is talking about, both of which we've talked about on this show before, which is that there was a tradition of continence, and this was usually, I mean, in some cases, this was usually solved simply by having multiple clergy in one church. So you didn't have to worry about, because of the fact that you could not sleep with your wife the day before the Eucharist. This is a simple rule that is established throughout church history. However, what we're talking about here,
well, actually, traditionally, it was much more extreme than that. There was like a 3-day fast.
Okay.
Because there's Friday, Saturday, and Sunday.
Okay.
So my point is that actually created these circumstances. But anyway, go ahead.
The point I'm trying to make is that the question here, which is priests being unmarried, is based in the actions of the Patarines in the 11th century. And I was wondering if there were other groups, but
no, I think the only other groups before them were the Manichaeans, and the Patarines were some sort of a type of a Manichaean. Now, we can just to bring up Canon 13 of Trilo again about the context there. Even though Saint Gregory at one point, in Ulrich of Imo brings this up, had suggested that clergy should, priests should abstain perpetually from the marriage bed with their wives. He actually withdrew from that. So according to Ulrich of Imo, he withdrew from that attempt based upon a vision he was seeing. Basically, skulls of children, drowned children, and such, which is actually fulfilled in Rome in the 11th century when, after this was done, people were throwing their children. Priests were throwing, I don't know, it was pretty bad, throwing their children in the river because people were afraid they're going to get deposed. So they created a worse situation no matter what. But anyway, what happened is that any attempt in the past to do this was never a violent attempt to begin with, all right? So what you had is, some pope would say this is really how everything should be done. If you're going to celebrate Mass every single day, no one really, it's kind of in a rescript, a matter of a council, you might say, all right? But there's no attempt ever to, depose mass numbers of people, sell people into slavery and all the rest. So what happens, the custom, which is in accord with the universal apostolic tradition, simply prevails on this matter. And it's let to set in that manner until the 11th century. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, hold on, let me get the text. Whatsoever therefore goes about to procure that God may not in effect do those things which he has done in his predestination, goes about to make void the very predestination of God. If then God have already in his predestination decreed that the sons of priests shall once be in effect, he that goes about to procure that they may not be in effect endeavors to destroy the work of God, because he has already done it in predestination, and so strives to overthrow God's predestination and to gain stand that will of God which is eternal. For God would, from eternity and before all worlds, create all men into the world, that in certain order, wherein he preconceived and predestinated to create them, he doth nothing disorderly. He created nothing in this world which he has not yet foreordained, by disposing it in the predestination of his mind that went before all worlds. That whatsoever, therefore, is by him created in this world, does not necessarily follow the predestination of his mind, predisposing and preordaining all things, because it is impossible that should not be done which God from eternity has willed and foreordained to be done. It is therefore necessary that all men should be created in that very order, wherein he will and from eternity foreordained, or else all men are not created as God would have them, nor as he foreordained them. But because this is inconvenient, it must needs be that they are created as he willed from eternity and forethought and foreordained, because he hath done all things that he would, and never did anything which he will not from everlasting, and hath foreconceived in his certain and unchangeable decree, for neither can his will be frustrated, nor his forethought deceived, nor his foreordinations altered. Which since it is so, neat as it must be, that laity, so priests also, of whom men are created, should yield their service to the divine will and preordination to the creating of them. For parents are not the authors of the creation of their children, but the servants, who, if they should not yield their service, they should, if it were possible, make void the forethought of God and resist his ordination, which, if they should wittingly do, they should offend the more, if ignorantly the less, not only against God the Father, but also against the heavenly Jerusalem, the mother of all the saints, because in what them were, they should not suffer those to be created of whom it is to be builded, and those things to be prepared whereby that celestial country is bestowed. But from this offense their impotence frees them, because they cannot resist the will of God and cross his preordination. For the will and predetermination of God is that eternal law in which the course of all things is decreed, and the pattern wherein the form of all ages is set forth, which can by no means be defaced. Not to yield our service there hereunto is evil, because to yield to it is good, and especially if it be done with a good intent, which is then done as parents meet together in a desire of propagation of issue, not in an appetite of exercising their lust. Of propagation, I say that both the present church may be multiplied, and the celestial city built, and the number of the elect made up, none of which could be done, which without such conjugal meeting. For if the first parents of the saints had continued all either continent or virgins, no saint would have been born of them into the world. None of them had been crowned with glory and honor in heaven, none of them ascribed into the number of angels. But since it is an inestimable good that saints are born into the world, that they are crowned with glory and honor in heaven, and that they are ascribed into the number of angels. Thereupon the fruitfulness of parents is more blessed, and their meeting holier. So then it is better for them to have begotten such children than not to have begotten them, and to have brought forth such fruit of marriage than to have been continent or virgins without fruit. Although it is good for some to be continents or virgins, namely for them whom God eternally will and preordained to be so created in the world, that they should remain either in continence or virginity, for as he hath eternally will and foreordained that some should be so created in the world, as that they should yield the fruit of marriage and beget children. So also hath he willed, and from eternity foreordained, some to be so created that they should continue in continency or virginity. And as those other yield their serve to the will and preordination of God in the creation of children, so these also serve the will and preordination of God in conserving their continence and virginity. And hereupon is both the fruitfulness of the one and the virginity of the other good and laudable, which, if it did not yield service to the will and preordination of God, would be neither good nor laudable, for whatsoever is contrary to the will and preordination of God is neither good nor laudable. If therefore God will and predestine some to be virgins, others to yield the fruit of marriage, for if all were virgins, no saint that is now is or shall be born should ever either be now or hereafter born in the world, neither should these virgins be at all, because they should not be born, for of the fruitfulness of the one arises the other's virginity. Therefore fruitfulness a great good, from which holy virginity hath proceeded. Now that there should be some virgins and others that should bear the fruits of marriage, the word which God soweth in their hearts teaches us. For in the hearts of some he soweth the word of good fruitfulness, yielding the increase in marriage. And in the hearts of others he sows the word of virginity. Those then in whom he sows the word of virginity, they desire to keep virginity. But those in whom he sows the word of marriage, they desire to yield the fruit of marriage.
Okay. Any comments, Father?
Well, no. It seems a very straightforward text. It matches again. This was in England, and is part of a much larger corpus of tractates against what the Hildebrandians were doing. It matches what Bishop Ulrich of Imola was saying in Italy. It matches what was being said in Germany. It matches what was happening in France. It's pretty much an incontrovertible fact that most of the lay clergy, the nominate, obviously, the clergy, parish clergy, were married priests, and this was being taken away from them. We do have a new question.
Now, it's interesting, I should point out, in concert with that after the Norman invasion, there was a attempt to impose initially the Hildebrandian program in England, or it failed miserably. And so what happened is they held a council in Winchester around 1075 or so, in which the rule was that the married clergy out in the villages were left alone. They were allowed, the deacons and married deacons and priests were allowed to continue, but the canons, they said, had to give up. Now, technically, no one objected to canons giving up their wives because they had already given vows. So, that's an example, and that's an example of how even in England, after the Norman conquest, they weren't quite able to enforce this, and it even led to a schism with the Hildebrandians between William the Conqueror and under William Rufus also for at least a 20-year period or so. Okay.
Well, we have a new question, and that's Anthony Michael here. He says, I've heard St. Bede was against married priests. Is this true?
You'd have to tell me where what supposedly is he said. I know St. Bede in one place says the ideal for married couples is total abstinence because he thinks they should take communion every day. Okay. So my point is that if this is my point, a lot of times there's no context to if they extract a quote from something. If I were to extract a quote from St. Bede where he says, and it is right and good that married people should abstain from the marital bed all days to partake of the sacrifice. Well, that would sound like St. Bede is condemning marriage, or he's trying to teach celibacy for everybody. All right? But there's a context. The context is he wants people to take communion every day, but he knows, that's not going to happen. He's not forcing that. It's kind of like, among some Orthodox, there's a practice called white marriage. All right? Okay. But most Orthodox don't do that, who are married, obviously. So I'd have to see that. I'd have to see the text and the context, and I'd even want to look at the manuscript history behind it.
Okay, so basically, if you can produce the text, that would be handy. We would be able to then analyze it and look at the context. And it's probably not nearly as explosive as people assume.
The other point is that oftentimes when St. Bede was dealing with priests, he only dealt with monastic priests. In fact, this is what's oftentimes ignored. In the early 700s, monasteries, basically monastic priests, took care of large portions of the entire country. And so, if there's a case of a monastic priest with a wife, that's a problem, obviously. The other point is that in some texts, I know this has been pointed out by a few authors, in some late Anglo-Saxon text, it will say the mass priest should not live with his wife. Well, the problem is that you'll find other texts that will say the priest, should, his wife should do this and this and this, and it's acceptable. Well, why would there be a differentiation between just a priest and a mass priest? Now, the Roman Catholic explanation, which I don't buy, is that they're using the word priest in a generic term, where it means all clergy. Well, to use the word presbyter in a generic term to apply to a tonsure doorkeeper doesn't make any sense to me. All right. So what is a mass priest? A mass priest is a priest who's ordained for the purpose of saying mass every single day. It's like almost like a kind of a semi-monastic state they're in, if they're not a monk already or canon. So
I was going to say that's usually a canon.
Exactly. So my point is that if this is what I've noticed, they'll bring up cases of St. Oswald or St. Dunstan or some other earlier saint telling canons in cathedrals that you can't be marrying these women after ordination marrying 2 or 3 women and divorcing them, or that's bad as it is.
Well, you might want to explain, because that's not it's not a very common Eastern custom. What is a canon?
Well, to be honest, a canon is essentially, for all intents and purposes, it's kind of like a form of monasticism. Basically, it is somebody who takes clerical tonsure. They agree to live in a community with other people who have taken clerical tonsure, from lowest order up to priests. They have to sing the hours together. They have to agree to a vow that they will not have wives, or if they have a wife, the wife will go to a nunnery. And they have common community of goods, and they have a prepositus or a prior of some sort, or a religious superior over them.
Well, the reason I make this distinction is because of the fact that since most people...
So canons oftentimes were put in charge of cathedrals, and they were to administer to the full-time administer to people what's going on in the city. All right.
These were not regular priests.
No, they weren't. They weren't generally parish clergy. They weren't clergy out in the middle of the village. For example, I just have a book somewhere, and it's St. Crotagan's Rules for Canons. And St. Crotagang makes a point where he says that at a certain point, if a cleric is like a boy joins a house of canons in like the years of 10 or 12, he's to be regulated. He isn't to be around the older people. There's a lot of it's imitating the rule of St. Benedict, to be honest. If you look at the rule of St. Crotagang written in like 750, St. Crotagang, who was a monk and was asked by the canons to write a rule for them, basically imitated almost completely the large portions of the rule of St. Benedict. And he'd say, look, if the boy at the time of like 16 or 17 decides he doesn't want to be a part of the community, he can go off and get married, and he can have a clerical career there. All right. But if they want to, they have to agree, not to be married. So my point is that bringing up issues about the mass priest or the canons of this or that place, you're essentially bringing up an example of somebody who's in what, for all intents and purposes, is a monastic state.
So wait,
in fact, there are cases in which houses of canons, for example, canons oftentimes would say that St. Augustine was their founder. All right. Now, technically, they existed before that. But if you look at the rule of St. Augustine, which is dated 400 AD, St. Augustine says he's founding a monastery to begin with. So
that's what I was about to say. This sounds
at
like a
that point,
metropolitan monastery.
this is kind of a splitting hairs about saying a canon isn't a monk.
But it just sounds like there's like monasteries that are out. Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
Hold on. I'm wondering if I have audio. I'm going to try to see if I can fix my audio issue.
Okay, so Father Joseph seems to be having audio.
Yeah, hold on.
I can hear you.
Hold on. Okay, good. No, what I was saying was, it seems to me that basically the difference between canons and basically regular monastics is because they're attached to cathedrals. It sounds like these are more like the city monasteries as opposed to the monasteries out in the mountains.
Yeah, well, the main problem that happened though was you had people, and this is why in England, for example, during the monastic reforms in the 10th century, Saint Dunstan, Ethelwold, and Oswald they didn't attack the idea of canons because it was approved by some saints. They really didn't like it because a lot of canons, a lot of the rules for canons did not mean they had to technically give up all forms of private property. So it was. I mean, you couldn't own a lot of. So you'd own like personal books and that kind of stuff. All right, and you could have a little bit of money, but the view was that this just simply got out of control. For example, canons were allowed to have a benefice. I can't pronounce the word. A beneficence, an allowance from the cathedral. And the idea behind this was that if you're a priest, you're celebrating mass every single day, and you're going to all these different villages, and you're doing all this stuff, you have to have some allowance to support you. All right. Well, in England, it kind of gets out of control because after the Viking invasions, the Vikings basically just destroy large amounts of churches. And so, in the late 800s, early 900s. What we would call non-canon clergy, secular clergy, so to speak, start moving into the collegiate churches. They take vows as canons, but they bring their wives along. So this creates a significant problem. And so I think there was one case in which Saint Ethelwold told them, "Look, you either live as canons, or you live as monks, or you leave." Because if you've taken these vows, and in many cases people were taking like a second or third wife after they divorced their first wife, after they were ordained a priest. So I mean, there were problems there, but you don't have, as far as I know, you're not having cases in the lives of the Anglo-Saxon saints of them going out into the villages and selling
chasing
people
out the married,
exactly.
Chasing out the married clergy. They just didn't want them in the canonry because the canonry were effectively monastic.
Yeah, I mean, if someone's a Roman Catholic today. Or comes from Roman Catholicism, and they hear about, let's say, the canons of Saint Augustine, or the canons regular, all right, that's kind of like what the idea was, for lack of a better word. Okay.
All right. So let's see here. If anyone has any questions, comments, thoughts, thanks for the Happy Feast of Pentecost. Sean, don't know what that means, but okay. Happy Feast. Let's see here. Past that, that was basically what we're going to touch on. What I wanted to talk about in the next half was, I don't want to make it totally about. I guess you could say we could talk. I mean, we could talk about honestly the Hildebrandian schism for the next 10 shows, and we will probably touch on them, I'm sure. But one of the things I want to do, you're a sensor. Can you give me a second, Wadika?
Okay. All right. Well, Father Joseph goes away to investigate the mysterious noise of the censer. Let's see if we have any comments. Looks like everybody's just wishing a happy Feast of Pentecost. Okay.
Okay. So anyway, sorry. No. Apparently, a YouTube video had opened up on a service behind my head, and I'm like hearing a sensor in the background. Like, okay, either I've just attained holiness that's beyond my wildest.
Can you adjust your microphone because there's a lot of background interference?
Yeah. Let me see if this is a little better. I have a noise control on the mic. How's that?
I guess, yes, it's all right.
Okay. But in any case, no, that was just that was the video playing on the background in my phone, and I didn't even realize that it was apparently a service. And I'm like, wow. Okay, so putting that aside, the point is, one thing I want to focus on is that we really do need to start working on reaching out to other people and challenging them and asking them why they're not becoming Orthodox. A lot of people have grown, I guess you could say, complacent. It should not be an acceptable answer when we're talking about salvation itself to say, well, I guess we could just agree to disagree on something. Truth is by its nature objective. It has to. We can't. I guess you could say simply. I guess just we can only go so far as to answer. But the point is, I think we have to proactively challenge, more people. I didn't get a chance to hear it. Lately, I heard that there was a debate between Jay Dyer and some Muslim guy. I thought, okay, well, that's an interesting thing. I did see a debate between an office site recently, so it's nice to see that people are starting to reach past, just where we are. Now, granted, we're Western rights, so of course we do focus on the West, and we do focus on, as you say, Western sects. But we need to, I think we need to go further than that and start really challenging other people. I think I mentioned I had a chat with an atheist fellow on his show, and I hope it was productive. But the point is, I think we need to do more of that. We need to start finding more people who would not normally challenge, getting out of our comfort zone, if that makes sense.
All right. So, unless we have another topic to discuss, or any questions, we could probably close down early, I think.
Okay. That's fine. I was okay. Yeah, I mean, that's fine. We can do that. If anyone has any questions or comments, let us know. We could stay on for another 5 or 6 minutes. How was the feast today, Benito?
Oh, everything went all right. Pentecost, everything went great for Pentecost. So, I heard from some of our clergy, everything went fine too. So
yeah, I saw a lot of pictures of feasts going on around the world, so that was awesome. And so it's today's the day of the founding of the church. It's a big deal because of the fact that it's really why we're here. The truth is, what would be the point if there was no ark of salvation? It would just be people debating. I mean, we have to think, and this was mentioned to me last night, that in the end, this has to be about remembering that in the end, the names of those who will be saved will be inscribed in the book of life. And what are we doing to help people get their names in the book? And that's the tough part. It's because a lot of times people think this is, let's just have an argument. Well, what's the point of that? Is the point salvation, or is the point something?
Well, if you're having an argument, this is something a lot of us, I'm sure the same. This, but if you're having an argument with somebody and it's a debate, and the other person isn't sincere, and they just want to win, that's all they want to do. You're not going to really have any. It's not going to be successful. It's going to be kind of this blood sports, and it's going to be entertaining, but it's not going to really solve anything. Everybody's going to be looking to get one over the other person.
Well, I mean, I experienced that even without blood sport in my debate when I was accused of a text that we agreed on being a forgery as some sort of gotcha. And, it's really a shame that people are more concerned about winning or pretending to win, even through deceit. Because if we think about it in the context of our salvation, if you're willing to do that in a debate, I mean, you're willing to go to hell. Well, that sucks. I mean, that's just a terrible way of looking at things. It's like, how can a debate be more important than salvation itself? And that's why I say we have to take these things more seriously. And we have to, and this is, okay, now hold on. We have a question, so we're going to go there. Does the church predate Pentecost? Well, the Old Testament church predates Pentecost, but not the New Testament church. This is the day of the coming down of the Holy Spirit.
There is a sense in which we say the church goes back to the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
But when we talk about Pentecost, we mean that's the foundation of the Orthodox Church. That's Christian. So
Yeah, so that's what we would say with that. So in that sense, when we say the birthday of the church, we're talking about the New Testament, the Orthodox Church. Okay, invincible ignorance. Yeah, that's a term that I've always found to be really. I think that's the biggest cop out. I mean, I hate to say that in like Roman Catholic thinking, is basically that if first off, it operates under an underlying assumption that your opponent's always wrong, which is fine if you're right, but they're wrong. But more importantly, it allows you to feel like if the person does not accept your arguments, then that's their loss anyway, because can't control their invincible ignorance. And it's a horrible cop out. I think it's one of the worst things that I've ever encountered. I did encounter that when I was a Roman Catholic, and I believed it for a while. But when I became Orthodox, I started to realize it is really a cop out. It's a way of just avoiding actual debate. And the more of the history with the formation of the Hildebrandian sect that became the Roman Catholic Church, you can see why. You got to chalk it up to invincible ignorance if a person's pointing out evidence of married priests and forged filioques. Well, what do you have left? They just don't understand us. They're invincibly ignorant. We have the truth. Sure, the truth isn't the truth you're holding, but hey, they're invincibly ignorant. It's an excuse.
I guess we can speak a little bit further about this. One of the important things you discover when you begin to look at the discussions, the so-called investiture controversy. It's euphemistically named the controversy.
Yeah, the controversy.
And I was reading recently I think it was called the Alexiad, I believe, by the Empress Anna Komnena. I believe it was called the Alexiad.
Okay.
And she was a daughter of one of the Byzantine emperors, Alexius Komnenos, I guess. And she died around like 1140 or so. And then I don't know if she was a nun, but she died in a convent, a nun's convent. Anyway, she talks about how she actually brings up, in a brief way, but it's like a page or so, the dispute between the Emperor Henry IV and Hildebrand. And she brings up some interesting facts that they had known in Constantinople that I hadn't quite read in anywhere else. Maybe Benzo of Alba mentioned some of it, in which the Emperor Henry, according to Anna Komnena, sends some legates, ambassadors, to negotiate with Hildebrand. And Hildebrand basically captures, has them seized, and their beards are shaved, which is a humiliation, by the way, to do that. And then they are horribly mutilated. And at which point, I think Henry. I think that was the point after Canossa where Henry realized there was really going to be no way he could have any kind of agreement with this guy. Because remember, you had Canossa. There was this brief reconciliation. It didn't last. Hildebrand then, obviously mutilates and kills some of the ambassadors from the German emperor. And he talks about how she talks about how Hildebrand raised an army. And in this one battle between the anti-Hildebrandian forces and the Hildebrandian forces, something like 30,000 people died.
Wow.
over these issues. There was there
was a mild controversy.
It was a mild controversy. One battle, 30,000 people died. Priests having their wives sold into slavery and them, put into dungeons and things like that. It's a controversy. But the key to it, I think, is the destruction of the concept and teaching of Symphonia. That's the whole key to it. And I didn't realize that for a very long time, because if you don't understand all this within the concept of Symphonia between Imperium and Sacerdotium, if that's just removed, then it's kind of this gradualist view or this assortment of kind of doctrines that kind of went under the radar and then just popped up and got consolidated, luckily by some guy or something like that, right? So, and like we spoke about, you look at the novella of Justinian, where the Emperor Saint Justinian, in I think some of his novellas, he's regulating the elections of bishops and the appointments of bishops, and
right.
It was just simply considered, and there were cases in which Justinian says that magistrates have to intervene if bishops aren't going to. If, for example, there were cases of there was bishops in Greece who were engaged in pederasty, and the local bishops did not do anything. It was, I don't know why, but the Emperor Justinian's view was that, well, if you're not going to do something, I'm going to do something. And he had them arrested. He had them brought to Constantinople. He had them tried. I think one of them was from Rhodes, actually. And when the evidence was brought and, they, were proven guilty, I think they were like castrated, and, one was exiled some or far off monastery, and the other simply died a few months later.
Well, I think that
now the point was that is by the secular historians will say that's Caesaro-papism, but from the Christian,
I was going to actually point that out.
From the Christian perspective of the time, the bishops aren't doing something. This is the horrible stuff is going on. And the emperor's position is that, look, I'm part of the church too, and I have a role in the church to protect it, even if it means from bishops who aren't doing what they should be doing. And no one tried to excommunicate or depose the emperor for that. Okay,
that's exactly what I was going to put up, because the concept of Western Symphonia was renamed ultimately, and it's used in apologetic straw man arguments against the Orthodox Church, and that's Caesaro-papism. The point is, Caesaro-papism, just like the investiture controversy, is another thing where they've renamed it into something. In this case, in the investiture controversy, quote unquote, you have thousands of people dying in war, priests' wives being enslaved, and basically the entire church being torn apart by an anti-pope. But that's just a controversy. Meanwhile, Symphonia, which was the true teaching of the church in both East and West, is presented after Protestantism as a heresy and would be used as Roman Catholics in the form of Caesaro-papism, so that they could accuse the Orthodox. But the point is, Caesaro-papism isn't real. Symphonia is. So this is a case where they've elevated Symphonia effectively to a heresy. And
the opposite, and what is really a heresy is obviously papism, or papo-Caesarism. We might call it papo-Caesarism.
The concept that because the Pope is over everyone.
Exactly. Yeah. He's all temporal power accrues to him.
So that's that's something that to keep in mind as well, is that the concepts that existed in the Orthodox West were constantly renamed to make them sound, when they were bad, more palatable, and when they were good, more evil.
Well, for example, Saint Gregory the Great was asked by one of the Frankish queens. There were like 3 Frankish kingdoms in the 500s. I can't remember which one. He was asked by the queen if he could bestow the amophor, or the pallium, which at that time was a gift, upon the Bishop of Autun. And St. Gregory in his letter said, well, I can only do this if the emperor permits. However, in the 11th century, if the emperor, the German emperor, said, I'm going to give I'm going to permit so-and-so to have the pallium, that suddenly becomes simony. All right, and is later read as what? Caesaro-papism.
Right.
Leo the Eighth says, like we addressed before, that elections of bishops have to be approved by the emperor, and that is read later as Caesaro-papism, where it was simply the normal functioning of the church. And in fact, this is one of the problems, my view. I've come to this view after several years, especially studying this issue. The major problem we have in the Orthodox world, obviously ecumenism and modernism, but those happened. Why? Because the Tsar was destroyed. The Tsardom was overthrown completely. All right. In fact, people forget back in 1904, 1905, the ecumenical patriarch Joachim III made this kind of crypto, tepid encyclical or epistle to the Russian Church about maybe they should investigate discussing the new calendar and how to have relations with the ramifications of Christian. They mean Protestants and such. And the Russian Church replied with an encyclical in 1905, in which basically the standard Orthodox view was set out: no calendar change. Orthodoxy is the only ark of salvation. We can talk to people, but there cannot be no joint services. None of that's going to go on. And essentially, it shut down the 1905 attempt to have an ecumenical movement. Now, what happens? Why does the ecumenical movement start off in earnest in 1920 and thereafter? Well, the Tsar is dead. The Russian Church is in complete disarray and being persecuted by the Bolsheviks. Yeah. So Symphonia, we have no Symphonia now in Orthodoxy. All right.
Now we should, to be fair, because I don't want to just isolate Patriarch Joachim as being the only problem with this the crypto ecumenical movement that was forming, because we know that Dr. Overbeck dealt with this as well.
Oh no, exactly, and I have a feeling he knew Joachim III. So was he saying some of this stuff because of little comments Joachim III was making to him?
Yeah,
it's kind of interesting that Overbeck starts making these anti-ecumenical before ecumenism statements, and he kind of has met Joachim III a few times. My point is still this: despite all the problems that were happening in Russia, despite all the problems, the Peter the Great reforms, and all the whatever they want to claim happened to the church. I mean, bad things did happen, obviously, and government overreach and whatever. As bad as that was, because they still had a kind of an Orthodox, at least nominal leader. I mean, he was more than a nominal leader. I mean, one of the reasons they listened to the Tsar to begin with, because he basically funded the Eastern Patriarchates, and the Russian Church did. So, I mean, if they started, doing crazy stuff, he just simply said, "I'm not going to give you any money." But my point is still, and he was their protector also from the Muslims too. So there was a lot of respect for him, even though there were cases on Mount Athos where, there were ultra nationalist Greek monks who simply would burn books printed in Moscow, even if they were Greek. I mean, there was some crazy stuff going on. People didn't like it, but this is why I think Satan, through his minions, basically in the Western liberal establishment and in the Marxists who are basically cooperating, have to kill the Tsar. So there is no. So my point is, you want to look at all the problems that happen in Orthodox history happen generally when the major lasting problems, let's say that, lasting problems that last for 150, 200, we're going on 100 years now with these problems, 1,000 years with papism, all right? What happens? There are usually cases in which one of these heretical groups rejects Symphonia, all right, or they kill the Tsar. I mean, they've effectively destroyed Symphonia in the Orthodox Church since 1917 anyway. So, that's why I think it's key to have that. That's why I'm actually so interested in translating the treatise, as I'm doing now, about the rights of kingship, Orthodox or Christian kingship from the York Anonymous. Because if you look in, let's say, 10th century Anglo-Saxon conciliar decisions, the king has the Witten or the Wittengemot, or the council. And the councils, that the wittancy that he holds, they're not just simply kind of a assembly of a few people. They oftentimes were composed of, it was the king, it was all the great magnates, which included the bishops, abbots, sometimes even abbesses, learned priests. They would be people from the villages, kind of like chief villagers. They had their own little village communes of sorts. There would be the earls, military commanders. There would be this like large council, all right? In the concept, what was being exhibited in those councils like that in England in the 10th century? It was the same thing that was being exhibited by King Recared when he renounced Arianism, and initially in 587, but then they held another council in 589. That's the Toledan councils. They're basically assemblies of the whole nation, and the nation means also is a Christian Orthodox nation, and so it includes the king, the magnates, the scholars, the bishops, the monks, all those people together. And they discuss all the issues. Now, the bishops have their own certain authority, obviously. But they did not conceive of this stark differentiation between the bishop and the king. If you know what I mean. I mean, they had, the king obviously didn't have holy orders. He didn't have the priesthood. But there was this idea that you had to work together because that's how the church functions. And we are all the church. However, once that's destroyed, beginning with Hildebrand, in the name of the investors or so-called controversy, in which they accuse everything of simony, once that's over with, then everything there's nothing restraining the papacy at that point, or whoever claims to be the Pope. So just like nowadays, there's nothing restraining the Fanar. There's nothing going to restrain the Fanar and all that it does.
Well, the biggest problem is that, and I think that, I hate to get into the whole geopolitics of this, but the simple reality is the Tsar also, he helped fund all the churches. And I can't help but notice that a lot of these folks, a lot of this stuff gets motivated by money. And that created a huge void in the typical functioning of the church.
In fact, the canons of the ecumenical councils and in many of the local councils presuppose having an Orthodox ruler and civil authority to enforce these mechanism decisions of a synod, to enforce, make sure the synod actually follows the rules. In some cases, emperors would make bishops assemble once or twice a year, and they would make sure proper rules were followed. By the way, and many bishops, by the way, welcomed that because they didn't want to be in a position where, they were going to have to, necessarily fight the other bishops over these things. So.
Hey, now here's this. Hold on, JG asked a question. I know this is an ask a priest type question, but is it okay to go to an old calendarist theology school for a bachelor's degree in Orthodox theology? I would say, yeah, that is an ask a priest type question. It's not that I'm trying to be flippant. It's just that, quite frankly, I only know of one TOC School of Theology in California, and I think that was the one.
I think there's one in Chicago. They have one. The GOCK has one in Chicago.
Okay, I thought they only had one in California, but okay, then I might have two.
As I recall, there was a Father John Sumners.
Yeah, I don't know what's happening with that school. Yeah, I remember
three I think it was called Three Hierarchs.
Yeah. Now the question I have here, because I hate to unpack this, but since you put it up here, I guess we have to ask, is what do you want to have that degree for? I mean, not that I'm trying to be odd on this, but I mean, first off, I question the value of most degrees unless they have a purpose. I can see why a law degree exists or a medical degree. Most jobs don't actually require the degrees that people have for them. And the point is, the question is, I mean, unless you're planning on teaching at the school or you're planning on becoming a priest or something, I'm not really sure what you would do with it. That you couldn't do with any other degree. I mean, is it just a preferred liking with courses? I think that can be accomplished much more cheaply by buying books. I don't know that that's necessarily something to leave out.
Well,
I apologize if it's a negative question.
Well, remember, some people can't really. For example, I simply will read books, and I can discuss things with people I know who also know things, and there's kind of give and back there, give and take. Not everybody learns like that though. Some people have to have some sort of structured class system.
Yeah, I understand that, but I mean, outside of priests, everyone I've seen who has some sort of theology degree, if they're not a priest, they're usually, I mean, I hate to say this, but they're often a public heretic, like the Fordham boys or Sister Vassar or something like that. The point is, they go into wacky town to get these degrees, and then they come out with these bizarre ideas, which don't have any productive purpose. So, I mean, the purpose to me for going to any Orthodox theology school for a bachelor's degree in theology is probably ordained ministry. And if it's not, then there's no, you're not going to come out and be a theologian, because in Orthodoxy, being a theologian is to commune with God. You're just a guy with a degree. So that's what I'm saying. Is the question is, what's it for? And if you look at the purpose, you can analyze whether or not it's right for you.
JG says to study true Orthodox Christianity and be around true Orthodox Christians and go to Divine Liturgy.
Every day. Well, yeah, but you could do that you move near a church. That's cheaper.
I think what he's saying is that if you go to a seminary, one of these seminaries, you're actually in a class building. You're actually doing this every single day. You're not just seeing people, because a lot of churches don't hold services every single day.
That's true.
And so there is an environment in which the seminary, in which if it's done properly, an Orthodox seminary becomes kind of like a monastery of sorts, almost. Even though for people who don't want to go to a monastery, right?
Yeah, but that's my point. Even if you take I hate to say this, but if you take even World Orthodox,
I'm just going to say if you want to do that, I have no problem. I don't.
Yeah, we're gonna agree to disagree on this, but all I'm saying is that if schools that do have that, just use a World Orthodox monastery as an example.
Father Joseph, your microphone is really, really bad.
I bought this microphone this week. I don't know why it's not working.
All kinds of distortion in the background. Maybe let's close down for tonight. We've pretty much answered the question and gone through the hour.
I only wanted to point out that most places that have daily services like that are educational facilities end up having monasteries anyway.
Okay.
So I think it's cheaper to live near a monastery. But okay.
We'll just we'll end the show on that note. Okay. And was there anything else we should discuss today? Or?
Oh no.
Okay. In that case, we're going to close down again for the feast of Pentecost. Have a great night, everyone, and thank you for listening to all our friends, listeners, and again, if anyone you meet anyone who wants to challenge the Orthodox tradition, we're open.
Benedicite.
Benedicite.